Remember that Lycan video? Well, that was fun. In that episode, I attempted to explain the changes we see within the Varcolacs and the Varcolac Alpha, but unfortunately I missed a massive crucial portion of the lore that is stated, and it's really been said to me about probably 4,893,691 times in the comments. So I figure what better time to revisit the Varcolacs than now while I am still receiving those comments. So considering we are about a month out now from the release of Resident Evil 8, you can plot exactly how many people have reached a fever pitch with the game based on mods for Lady Dimitrescu. And it seems to kind of be cooling off now, which means more people have reached the point that they have played it, and we all know how the events unfold. So with that said, let's dive into this episode exploring the lore and morphology, as well as the neurological and physiological changes to the human form, which results in the Varcolacs from being man to beast. So to begin this thing, after your crash in the woods near a small village in Europe, you crawl out of the truck and enter a pretty thick forest. Making your way through the woods, you eventually begin to start seeing creatures run ahead of you just out of sight. Making your way through a house at first, something big crashes through the building upstairs and then makes an exit point for Ethan. Making your way over a hill, you come out to a clearing and spot the village where a bunch of crap will be going down. As you move into the village, you eventually come across a man who seems to be the only other human you have spotted since getting there. Almost immediately, an attack is launched by the Lycans, which were the villagers who have been infected with the mold, and their bodies have shown low affinity for the Cado parasite, which if you would like to see that video over these specific Lycans that I've just mentioned, I will link that at the end of this one. Although this video's point is just really to clear up some of the missed lore, as it was stated in my first video. Anyhow, as an attack is launched on what is basically just you, eventually you end up dropping enough of these Lycans to have them just sort of take off. Really, they are heeding the call of presumably the lords, as their leader Urias then takes off with his group. Heading deeper into the village, at this point you run across an injured man and his daughter. It's obvious the man has been bit, but they are attempting to make it to Louisa's house for safety. So now this is why you don't bring somebody infected with werewolfism into your home. He turns and annihilates everyone in the room except for you and his daughter. However, as you're escaping the carnage, it soon becomes apparent that he is still on your tail, and eventually he and his daughter are both lost to the fires below. Exiting the not so safe house, you head back to the castle to attempt to find your daughter. And from here, basically everything just goes haywire. But shortly after you escape from the clutches of all the Lycans in the fun run, you eventually end up back in the wonderful world of werewolves. Exiting behind a building, you are immediately attacked by a creature that, it's really horrifying, and the reason it's so horrifying is the Uncanny Valley reference, but also everything else about it. Up to this point, the Lycans appear at least somewhat human and maintain a hominid-looking form. However, this creature has gone full-on canine for the most part, and the speed at which it's able to run down Ethan makes it an imposing beast to have hunt you and then also hunt in return. After being attacked, you run into a small barn and then find that Louisa's husband also ran into this thing. He mentions how it's no wolf, which is a fair line of thinking, but he doesn't actually know what it is. All he knows is that he's losing a lot of blood and he can still hear the thing skulking around outside. Now that we are in the midst of this thing's hunting ground, we begin to get a good look at exactly what we're dealing with, how it moves, and potentially what has happened concerning internally brain capacity, and this can be explained by its origins. But to understand the internal anatomy, we must first take a look at the presenting morphological characteristics, which will then clues as to why it has changed the way it has. Now this may sound familiar to some, but we will get more heavily into the genetics later. But starting with the feet of this creature, it's a blending of a plantigrade structuring of the foot as well as digitigrade. In some ways, it's quite normal for humans to walk on the balls of their feet, such as when we are running, but with the Varcolac, it will walk on the balls of its feet when running, as well as almost on its toes, which is completely unnatural for humans to do. What's interesting is sometimes when the creature is slowly walking around an area looking for prey, it will still walk on the flat of its feet like its previous human form would, but this will bend the ankle at a very unnatural angle. This requires the knee to almost be hitting the ground when it does this. But speaking of upper leg portions, as we move up, we see the muscle in this area has increased as well as bone length within the feet themselves and the tibia and fibula. The knee will sit much further out around the feet, and the thighs have also increased in size. Something that also needs to be noted here is the actual amount of hair that the body has on it. We'll go into why it has grown so much, but moving up to the pelvis, it would appear to me that the pelvis actually is, to accommodate the new way of walking, it would have to be more forward facing like a chimpanzee's would, and this allows for more quadrupedal walking than bipedal. The abdomen, chest, and back of this creature have all increased in size. In fact, so much that the creature can no longer fit through a very large barn door or just even the opening of a house. The chest becomes stuck, and this may likely be due to how the back looks. Swinging actually around to the back, we see kind of a hunchback has begun to form, indicating that the vertebral column has had the individual vertebrae increased in length, much like what we have seen with the legs increasing in size. And this has rendered the creature to be much larger in general, as it has become longer, giving it a much more wolf-like appearance. Moving down to the arms, we see the arms definitely did increase in length. The muscle would have been stretched out for the most part, but would obviously need to be also increased in size to accommodate for the new role in walking. And this would mean that the shoulder joint would likely have been beefed up concerning bone structuring to allow the ability, as human shoulders really aren't necessarily the most stable and strong joint on our bodies. But moving down to the forearms, we see the radius and ulna bone have likely become around double the length of their original human form, and this length increase will continue into the fingers. The fingers, they now really kind of walk on the balls of their hands, with the fingers actually jutting out to support the weight appropriately. On each finger exists a claw several inches in length that can be used for slashing and eviscerating any human or animal that gets in its way. Then moving up to the head, it's just complete nightmare fuel. Just straight up. The mandibles as well as the maxilla of the skull have been lengthened well outside of the normal proportions of Homo sapiens. Instead of the standard omnivore teeth that you and I have, they have morphed into a pure carnivorous teeth and now line the entire mouth. Whereas the skin covers the sides of our mouth, when the skull was lengthened, this split the skin and has turned it into a much more canine concerning physiology as it opens all the way back up to the molars. Then moving up to the skull, we see the original human nose is still there but has been pushed forward by the maxilla increasing in length. The eyes are blue with huge canine-like irises, which means that there's very little sclera of the eye, or the white portion of the eye, visible. Tiny pinpoint pupils sit in the center, and the hair found all over the body continues on the head of this creature, creating a shaggy appearance of it overall. Getting a good look at its morphology, we see that this creature falls completely outside the realm of what usually the mold and parasite would do to a person. Whereas the Lycans still somewhat resemble humans concerning overall body shape, because there are, some stark differences concerning their previous form versus what they have become now. With the Varcolacs, the physiological changes are so jarring, the only option is there must have been manipulation in other ways to account for these changes. Now, here's the lore I missed. Salvatore Moreau is responsible for these beasts. Experimentation on the Lycans did not end after their transformation. In an effort to further refine their prowess and abilities, Salvatore would take wolf blood containing the genetic information of said wolf and inject it into the spines of the Lycans. Once injected, this would obviously normally inspire a standard immune response to foreign materials that enter the body. However, with the mold having control of these bodies, this DNA would be used to further splice in and change the physical being. It would appear the mold definitely affects the genetics of creatures. Working its way in, it is able to influence the person on a cellular level. In fact, this was mentioned in my Resident Evil 7 video, where the mold was able to affect the mitotic pathways of cells, allowing for Ethan to heal himself from extremely grievous wounds, which, as we all know, is heavily referenced and discussed in Resident Evil 8. So that was pretty cool to see that thinking continue on in this game. Anyhow, as the mold begins manipulating genes, it would appear that the first thing it does is influence certain aspects of the body's genes that may actually be dormant. In humans, things like overproduction of hair would be something that is muted in our DNA that is subsequently unmuted when the mold takes place. In fact, I mentioned this in my Lycan video, but just, for repetition's sake, humans actually have the same amount of hair follicles as chimpanzees, it's just a finer hair. So really, if you thicken up that hair, we would just really look like chimpanzees. But as the genes that are already in our coding are activated, we can begin to see a lot of old traits that we have evolved in the past brought back to the forefront with Homo sapiens, as well as when they become Lycans, which is interesting to say the least. However, with the Varcolacs, more was needed to create them. As the wolf cells entered the spinal cord and the cerebrospinal fluid, again, the immune response should have taken place, but it never did, because the mold has complete control over the host and how their body responds. Instead, the wolf cells would be infiltrated much like humans would, and the DNA would be extracted and manipulated. As this new DNA is contorted and genes are activated from the evolutionary pathway of a wolf, a chimera would begin to form. This chimera is known as the Varcolac. Eventually, the mold would begin bridging gaps between cells. Human and wolf DNA would combine in the cells as they continue on their mitotic pathways to keep the creature alive. Whether the mold is intentionally doing it is unknown at this point, as it may just be standard interaction to control the entire host, but as this coupled with the Cadeau parasite, as seen with others, gives us a pretty clear indication that the mold might make it possible to bridge these gaps, but the parasite is the one with the intention. Eventually, as no more pure human cells and no more pure wolf cells exist within the body anymore, every portion of this creature would be chimeric in nature. And this would ultimately result in some pretty large changes in the body of them. Discussing the outward presentation of this physiology has been done, but internally, there's a lot of changes that may have taken place, and likely did take place. Concerning the bones of this creature, they have increased in length in large part due to the wolf DNA. Considering wolves are wholly quadrupedal, these bones would have the osteoblasts activated to continue to grow the bones, and likely the growth plates at the ends of the bones would have reactivated, allowing for the lengthening. And this has been known to happen in humans with pituitary gland tumors as their body undergoes a second round of growth, but it unfortunately leads to many issues internally, such as nerve damage and also weaker bones. Muscle growth of the body would also be something influenced by the addition of wolf DNA. The reasoning for this is you can sort of look at it as having, two rockets on the same spacecraft. The human gene codes for a certain amount of muscle to be used based on body types. We will call that just Engine 1, with the addition of another set of genetic coding, and this will bring more muscle coding to the plate. In this case, the wolf DNA is pushing for more muscle in areas, as that was what was successful for its species, so Engine 2. And another way you could think about this, which makes probably way more sense than the actual thing I just used, it's called super male syndrome. Essentially, you have two Y chromosomes, and you can actually have double muscle mass in certain areas. You're not really that much stronger than a normal person, but it would be doubled up. Now, there's going to be people in the comments who don't know what super male syndrome is, or they're going to say anecdotally that I did not see anybody with double muscle. It's not standard across the board that you will have double muscle. It just presents in different ways. For instance, I knew a guy whose calf muscles, because he had super male syndrome, were quite literally double the size of mine. And the only reason I knew that he had super male syndrome is I went and I asked, I was like, dude, how do you have such big calf muscles? And he explained what it was. I was like, well, that makes sense, I guess, yeah. So it can present in different ways with different muscles, or it could not present in muscle at all. It just really depends. But anyhow, all this coupled together increases the overall size and appearance, more specifically in the legs, as again, that was typically what is most muscular on the wolves overall. But what's interesting is, with this coinciding genetics, it can be assumed that if the muscular systems are affected, the osseous systems are affected, and even the hair follicles are affected, then we can safely assume that the nervous system and pathways are affected as well. And this is indicated by how the body operates and what the Lycans actually use these creatures for. With likely the nervous system of this creature being doubled up, an issue begins to form for the intellect of these beasts. Now, it works in favor in some ways and others not so much. Concerning how it may work in favor, the standard nervous system of a Homo sapiens would not be enough to bridge the gap in the body concerning length, which would render it paralyzed, likely around the spine areas, because the spinal cord would be stretched and destroyed. Either that, or at minimum, severe nerve damage would make its limbs virtually useless and uncoordinated, as not enough juice could be sent down the line of the motor neurons to appropriately activate the muscle fibers. However, with the doubling up from the wolf coding, likely nerves would continue to divide to accompany the lengthening of the body. With these nerves dividing and providing a route for muscular activation, this would be a good thing, as you might imagine, as it's able to hunt and appropriately use the muscle fibers at its disposal. In this case, the Varcolac is able to jump several stories from below onto buildings, such as on the farm, to reach prey that may be using the tops of buildings to keep away from this creature, meaning that the only real safe area is actually inside of a building. However, the reason the safe area is inside of a building is also how the nervous system is negatively impacted by the doubling up of these neurons and the newly found mitosis in the system. Well, I say newly found, nerves can divide, it's just not very common for them to do so, more so in the brain after adulthood is reached. So, with the nervous system doubling up, we can assume now that the brain has also undergone these same issues. This doubling of neurons in the brain sounds pretty great, doesn't it? After all, more brain matter, more thinking ability, right? Well, that's actually the issue. So we as a species currently are at our near maximum capacity for our brains. Our brains can get a little larger, which would make us possibly more intelligent, but a tipping point is reached soon after. The issue is fundamentally how our brains work. With an electrical signal having to carry across cells, it can only be as fast as a neuron fires. There are things to help it along faster, such as the myelin sheath, which speeds up the signal in the axon. The issue is, however, as more and more neurons get in the way, the finely tuned properties of our brains begin to falter. The signal begins to get much slower, with so much tissue having to be traveled through that this makes thoughts become quickly disjointed and thinking ability decreases. As the neurons continue to divide, driven by the addition of the wolf genes, a new line of thinking would likely begin to emerge: pure instinct. Humans have instinct now, but a lot of it can be overridden by our cerebrums and areas such as the frontal lobes. However, with these areas reaching a point that they are operating so slowly due to the added neurons, animalistic instinct would be all that remains. So think of it this way: human instinct plus wolf instinct would result in a higher than normal animalistic tendencies, as there are positive factors being combined. However, human thinking plus wolf thinking is kind of like a positive and a negative combining, which decreases what originally made you human. These factors coinciding with the decreased reasoning ability means that whatever was human is basically just an animal now. In fact, this is displayed in the lore quite readily. The Varcolacs are essentially used as massive attack dogs by the Lycans. Kept in chains and used to sniff out survivors, they're purposely created to basically just be a guard dog for the pack, despite the fact that they too come from the same creature, that creature being Homo sapiens. It's just their mental ability that has been diminished heavily, resulting in what is basically just an animal at this point. However, there are some areas that may have benefited from this new added wolf DNA, such as the olfactory bulb and the temporal lobe, resulting in better ability to discern smells and having a better ability to hear, which may help the Varcolac hunt prey more effectively. Now, something to note between the standard Varcolac and the Varcolac Alpha alpha is that there really is no major differences between the two. They are still roughly the same size, possess the same amount of hair, but the durability of the alpha is higher than that of the standard variant. But I bet you're sitting there asking yourself, well, how does Varcolac take you out? Well, I am happy to oblige that inquiry. Should you get too close to a door and be pulled out by the Varcolac, run down by the Varcolac, or just in general knocked down, to everyone who's not Ethan Winters, basically because of his insane healing ability, this creature would one-shot you extremely easily. Using its powerful forelimbs, it can hold you down by your chest and then dig into your abdomen with its teeth, and then begin snacking on your intestines. It would very quickly hit your abdominal aorta, and at this point, you would probably bleed out in less than 30 seconds. And seeing as the metabolism requirements of the Varcolac are quite high, your body would likely be devoured whole. Pretty brutal.